The carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the road, and Alara Whitmore was thrown forward so hard her shoulder struck the door. Outside, the rain had turned the path to Ashcombe Manor into a river of mud, and the driver cursed under his breath as the horses fought to keep their footing on the slope. She gripped the seat and forced herself to breathe. There was no room for fear now. She had already left everything behind her, and there was no road that led backward. She arrived at the manor soaked to the bone, her trunk dragged behind her by a footman, who did not bother to hide his irritation at the weather. The great house rose out of the mist like something carved from old bone, its windows dark except for a few flickering lights on the ground floor. Alara stood at the base of the stone steps and looked up at it, and for a moment she almost turned around. But she had nowhere else to go, not anymore. The door opened before she could knock, and a tall woman, with iron-gray hair and a face like a closed door, looked her over from head to foot. "You are late," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Bell, housekeeper of this house. You will address me as such, and you will not make a habit of tardiness." "I am sorry," Alara said. "The roads were difficult." "The roads are always difficult for those who do not plan ahead." Mrs. Bell stepped back to let her in, though the gesture felt more like a trap closing than an invitation. "You are the new companion for Lady Margaret. I hope you understand what that means. She is old, she is proud, and she does not suffer fools. Neither do I." Alara said nothing. She had learned, in the last difficult months, that silence was often the safest answer. She was led through a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women who all seemed to be looking down their noses at her, as if they already knew she did not belong. The air smelled of beeswax and old smoke. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck the hour, slow and heavy, like a warning. Mrs. Bell stopped outside a small door, at the end of a narrow hallway near the kitchens. "This is your room. It is not much, but it is more than most companions are given. Lady Margaret will see you in the morning. Until then, stay out of sight and do not wander the house. The family does not like strangers underfoot." The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand inside it. A single window looked out onto a gray stretch of garden, already losing its color to the coming winter. Alara set down her trunk and sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since she had left London, she let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. 6 weeks ago, she had been Alara Ashworth, only daughter and sole heir to one of the largest trading fortunes in the country. Her father's ships had carried goods across 3 oceans, and his name had opened doors in every great house, from London to Edinburgh. When he died, suddenly, and without warning, the world she had known collapsed around her. Within days, men had come to her door with offers of marriage, dressed up as condolences. Distant cousins she had never met arrived to remind her of family duty, meaning the duty to hand her fortune into a husband's hands before some cleverer relative found a way to take it first. Lawyers circled her like crows. She had watched, disgusted and afraid, as men who had never once asked after her happiness suddenly could not stop speaking of it, always in the same breath as her father's money. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She had taken a small portion of her savings, changed her name to Whitmore, and answered an advertisement for a lady's companion in a household far from London, where no one would think to look for a runaway heiress. She had told herself it would only be for a season, long enough to grieve in peace, long enough to think clearly, without a dozen voices telling her what to do with her own life. She had not expected the household she landed in to be quite so cold. There was a soft knock at her door, and before she could answer, it opened. A young woman stood in the doorway, dressed in a gown far too fine for the hour, her golden hair pinned with pearls that caught the low candlelight. She looked Alara over the same way Mrs. Bell had, though with considerably more amusement in her expression. "So you are the new one," the young woman said. "I am Lady Vivian Ashcombe. This is my brother's house, in case no one has told you yet. And you are?" "Alara Whitmore, my lady." "Whitmore." Vivian repeated the name, as if testing whether it was worth remembering. "Well, Whitmore, I hope you know what you have signed on for. My grandmother is difficult on her best days, and impossible on her worst. The last companion left after only a fortnight, in tears, I might add." She smiled, and there was no warmth in it at all. "I do hope you last longer than that. It is such a bother, training new staff." "I will do my best," Alara said quietly. "See that you do." Vivian's gaze dropped to the plain gray traveling dress Alara still wore, damp at the hem from the rain. Goodness. Did you walk here from London? Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice even. The carriage was delayed by the weather, my lady. Of course it was. Vivian turned to go, then paused at the door. A word of advice, Whitmore. In this house, companions are seen and not heard, and preferably not seen very much either. Keep to the edges of rooms. Do not speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, do not embarrass yourself in front of my brother's guests. We are expecting Miss Cordelia Hart and her family this week, and everything must be perfect. The door shut, and Alara sat alone in the dim little room, staring at the flickering candle on the washstand. She thought of her father's warm study in London, the smell of ink and salt air that always seemed to cling to his coat when he returned from the docks. She thought of the life she had lost, and the strange, smaller life she had chosen instead. It was humbling, in a way she had not expected. No one here knew her as the daughter of a great trading house. No one bowed to her or sought her opinion on matters of business. Here, she was simply Whitmore, the companion, the woman who arrived late and soaked in the rain. She told herself it did not matter. She had wanted anonymity, and now she had it. If it came wrapped in scorn, she would endure the scorn. She had endured far worse in the weeks after her father's death. Morning came gray and cold, and Alara was woken before dawn by a sharp rap on her door. A young maid, no older than 15, poked her head in. Mrs. Bell says, "You're to dress and go up to Lady Margaret straight away. She don't like to be kept waiting." Alara dressed quickly in her plainest gown, tied her hair back without the aid of a mirror, and followed the maid up 2 flights of narrow servant stairs into the main part of the house. The contrast was immediate and striking. Where the servants' quarters were bare stone and worn wood, the family's wing was all gilt and polished marble, high ceilings painted with scenes of gods and clouds, heavy curtains the color of wine. Lady Margaret's room was at the end of the corridor, and the maid knocked twice before pushing the door open and stepping aside to let Alara enter alone. The old woman sat propped up in a great 4-poster bed, a shawl around her thin shoulders, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Her eyes were sharp and pale blue, and they fixed on Alara the moment she stepped through the door, missing nothing. "So you are my new companion." Her voice was thin but clear, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent a lifetime being obeyed. "Come closer, girl. I cannot see you properly from there, and I have no patience for shouting across a room." Alara approached the bed and stopped a respectful distance away, her hands folded in front of her. Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You do not look like a companion," she said finally. Alara's heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. "I am not certain what a companion is meant to look like, my lady." Frightened, eager to please, desperate for the wage, usually, though they try to hide it. Lady Margaret's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. "You carry yourself like someone who has never once worried where her next meal was coming from. Curious, for a woman answering an advertisement for hired company." Alara kept her expression carefully neutral, though inside her stomach had turned to ice. "I have fallen on difficult circumstances, my lady, as many do." The old woman did not look entirely convinced, but she let the matter drop, for now. "Well, whatever your story, you are here, and I suppose you will do until you prove otherwise. Sit, read to me. My eyes are not what they once were, and the mornings are long." Alara sat in the chair beside the bed and took up the book left on the side table, a worn volume of old poetry, and began to read aloud in a low, steady voice. As she read, she felt Lady Margaret's gaze linger on her, thoughtful and unhurried, like someone turning over a puzzle in their mind. It was the first quiet moment Alara had known since she arrived, and she let herself sink into it gratefully, unaware that behind those pale, sharp eyes, a suspicion had already begun to take root, one that would not let go easily. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alara rose before the sun to attend Lady Margaret, endured the sideways glances and muttered comments of the household staff, who saw her as neither one of them, nor one of the family, and retreated each night to her small, cold room, exhausted in a way she had never been in her old life of comfort. She learned quickly that Lady Vivian's warning had not been an exaggeration. Companions were expected to be invisible, and Alara made herself as small and quiet as she could manage, hoping to avoid notice, until her contracted season was complete, and she could slip away again, richer in solitude if nothing else. But invisibility, she was learning, was a difficult thing to maintain in a house already so full of tension. Ashcombe Manor was beautiful from a distance, all stone towers and old ivy, but up close, it groaned under the weight of debts no one spoke of openly. She overheard the servants whispering about unpaid tradesmen, about the roof that leaked in the east wing, about the Duke himself, a man she had not yet even seen, who was said to be desperate for a marriage that would save the family from ruin. She had not yet met Duke Rowan Ashcombe, though his name was spoken constantly in the house, always in tones of quiet urgency, as though the very walls depended on his next decision. She wondered, in idle moments, what kind of man inherited a crumbling fortune and a title heavy with expectation. She imagined him old before his time, worn down by responsibility, cold and calculating like his sister. She did not imagine that within the week, everything she believed about her quiet, hidden life would begin, slowly, and without her knowledge, to unravel. On the third evening, as she carried a tray of tea up the back stairs toward Lady Margaret's room, she rounded a corner too quickly and collided with someone coming the other way. The tray tipped, and she barely managed to catch it before the porcelain shattered against the floor, though a good deal of tea splashed across the front of her only decent gown. "Watch where you are going," came a low voice, not unkind, but startled and a little sharp. Alara looked up and found herself facing a tall man in a plain dark coat, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been outdoors in the wind, his eyes a deep and steady gray. He looked at the spilled tea, then at her ruined dress, and something like concern flickered briefly across his face, before it settled back into careful indifference. "I am sorry, sir," Alara said quickly, righting the tray. "I did not see you." "No harm done," he said, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "You are new. Lady Margaret's companion, I take it." "Yes, sir." He nodded once, distracted, already glancing past her down the hallway, as though his thoughts were elsewhere, on some heavier matter. "Mind the stairs. They are steeper than they look, especially in poor light." And with that, he continued on his way, leaving Alara standing alone, with a tea-stained dress, and no idea that she had just exchanged her first words with the Duke of Ashcombe himself. It was only later, when a maid mentioned in passing that the master of the house had been seen coming down from his study looking troubled, that Alara realized who she had bumped into. She thought little of it at the time. He had barely looked at her twice, and she had far greater concerns than the impression she left on a distracted nobleman. She could not have known, standing there in her ruined gown with her heart still racing from the near disaster of broken china, that in a locked drawer in a London solicitor's office, a letter was already being drafted, one that would soon travel by fast post directly to Ashcombe Manor, carrying a name and a description that matched her own, so closely there could be no mistake. Nor could she have known that the very fortune she had fled from, the one she had disguised herself to escape, was the same fortune this crumbling house so desperately needed to survive. For now, she only knew the cold of her small room, the ache in her back from long hours of reading aloud, and the quiet, gnawing loneliness of a woman who had given up everything familiar to buy herself a little peace. She undressed by candlelight, laid the ruined gown aside to be cleaned in the morning, and climbed into her narrow bed, listening to the wind pull at the shutters outside. Tomorrow would bring Miss Cordelia Hart and her family, the guests Lady Vivian had spoken of with such careful excitement. Tomorrow, the house would fill with silk and jewels and careful smiles, and Alara Whitmore, once Alara Ashworth, would once again be expected to disappear into the background, unseen and unheard, a shadow among the grand furniture. She closed her eyes, unaware that the week ahead would test every ounce of the quiet dignity she had left, and unaware, too, that somewhere beneath the polished surface of Ashcombe Manor, forces were already moving that would soon make her disappearance entirely impossible. A scream tore through the east wing before the sun had even cleared the tree line, and Alara was on her feet before she fully understood why. She threw open her door to find a young maid sobbing in the corridor, pointing at a shattered blue vase scattered across the floor of the upstairs hall, its pieces glittering like broken ice against the dark wood. "It was not me," the maid was saying over and over, to anyone who would listen. "I swear on my mother, it was not me." Mrs. Bell arrived within moments, her face like thunder, and the household staff gathered quickly, in the way people do when disaster promises a story worth repeating. Alara stood at the edge of the growing crowd, still in her nightclothes with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, and said nothing, though something cold settled in her stomach the instant she saw Lady Vivian appear at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a silk robe, looking down at the wreckage, with an expression far too calm for someone who had just lost a family heirloom. "That vase belonged to my grandmother's mother," Vivienne said, her voice carrying easily down the corridor. "It came from Italy. It is irreplaceable." Her eyes swept over the gathered staff, cool and searching, before landing, almost lazily, on Alara. "Whitmore, were you not on this floor last night, carrying tea to my grandmother?" Alara's breath caught. "I was, my lady, but I did not come near this hall. The vase was not broken when I passed." "How curious that you remember so precisely." Vivienne descended the stairs slowly, her silk robe trailing behind her like a shadow. A companion who arrived only days ago, already familiar with every corner of my family's home. "Tell me, Whitmore, why should any of us believe a stranger, over a lifetime of trust in this household?" "I did not touch the vase," Alara said again, quiet but firm. "I would not lie about such a thing." "Everyone lies about such things," Vivian said pleasantly, as though discussing the weather. "It is only a question of how well." She turned to Mrs. Bell. "See that the cost is deducted from her wages." "It seems only fair, given the circumstances." Alara felt heat rise up her neck, a mixture of anger and helplessness she had not felt since the worst days following her father's death, when strangers had spoken over her and about her, as though she were not even present in the room. She wanted to argue, to demand proof, to point out that any number of the household staff had passed through that hall in the night. But she had learned, painfully, what it meant to be poor and powerless in a house that was not her own, even if the poverty was only a disguise she wore. To argue too loudly would only draw more attention, more suspicion, more danger to the fragile anonymity she had built for herself. So she lowered her eyes and said nothing further, and the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring, some sympathetic, most simply glad the misfortune had not landed on their own wages. Later that morning, as she helped set the long dining table for the arrival of the Hart family, Alara caught the eye of the young maid who had first discovered the broken vase. The girl gave her a small, grateful nod, and in a low whisper, as she passed with a stack of linen napkins, she murmured, "I know it weren't you. I saw the cat knock it over myself, hours before you ever came up them stairs. I just didn't dare say so in front of her ladyship." "Thank you for telling me," Alara whispered back, and found, strangely, that the small kindness eased something tight in her chest, even if it changed nothing about the deduction already promised from her wages. By midday, the manor had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Fresh flowers appeared in every vase that remained unbroken. The long dining table gleamed with polished silver, and even the tired old portraits in the hallway seemed to have been dusted with extra care. Mrs. Bell moved through the halls like a general preparing for battle, barking orders at footmen and maids alike, her sharp voice echoing off the marble floors. "The Hart family arrives within the hour," she announced to the assembled staff. "Miss Cordelia Hart is to be treated with the utmost courtesy. Her father's fortune is considerable, and this house has considerable need of it. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is to go wrong today." Alara, standing near the back of the servants, gathered for instruction, felt a small pang of something uncomfortably close to pity. She understood now, more clearly than before, the desperate calculation running beneath the surface of every polished smile in this house. The family needed money, and Miss Cordelia Hart represented the solution to that need, wrapped in silk and expectation. It was not so different, she realized, from the marriages that had been urged upon her in London. Except here, the desperation ran the opposite direction, a family hunting a fortune rather than fleeing one. She thought, briefly, and with a flicker of dark humor she did not share with anyone, how strange it would be if the household ever learned that the very fortune they so urgently needed was already living quietly among them, disguised in a plain gray dress and mended stockings. The carriages arrived precisely on schedule, 4 of them, loaded with trunks and hat boxes enough for a month's stay, rather than a single week's visit. Alara watched from an upstairs window as the Hart family descended. Mr. Hart, a stout, red-faced man who laughed loudly at his own jokes before anyone else had a chance to react. His wife, a thin woman draped in more jewelry than seemed practical for daytime wear, and their daughter, Miss Cordelia Hart, who stepped down from the carriage last, moving with the careful, practiced grace of someone who had been trained since childhood to be looked at. Cordelia was beautiful in an obvious way, all golden curls and wide blue eyes, and she smiled prettily as Duke Rowan Ashcombe himself came down the front steps to greet the family personally. It was the first time Alara had seen him since their brief collision in the hallway, and she studied him now from her hidden vantage point, curious despite herself. He looked, she thought, like a man performing a role he had not chosen for himself. His smile was polite but distant, his bow correct but without warmth, and when Cordelia laughed at something her father said and touched his arm lightly, Alara saw him glance, just for a moment, toward the upper windows of the house, as though seeking an escape route rather than admiring his intended bride. She stepped back from the window before he could catch her watching, and returned to Lady Margaret's room to continue the afternoon's reading, though her thoughts kept wandering back to that brief, strange glimpse of a man trapped by circumstance, not unlike herself. Dinner that evening was a grand affair, though Alara saw none of it directly. Companions did not dine with the family, a fact Mrs. Bell had made clear on her very first day. Instead, she ate a simple meal in the small servants' dining room, seated at the far end of a long table beside the scullery maids, listening to second-hand gossip carried down from the dining room above, by footmen, returning with empty serving trays. Miss Hart barely touched her soup, one footman reported with amusement, too busy watching the master's every move, and Lady Vivian kept steering the conversation toward wedding matters, bold as anything, right in front of Mr. Hart himself. "And the Duke?" asked one of the older maids, leaning forward with interest. "Quiet as ever. Answered when spoken to, but I'd wager he'd rather be anywhere else in the world." The footman shrugged, reaching for another slice of bread. "Can't say I blame him, given the circumstances. A man ought to choose his own wife, not have her chosen for him by a mountain of unpaid bills." Alara said nothing, though she found herself thinking, uncomfortably, of the letters that had piled on her own writing desk in London, in the weeks after her father's death, each one a proposal, dressed up as sympathy, each one asking for her hand, while truly reaching for her fortune. She had run from that fate, and here she sat, listening to a man's own version of the same trap, though he, unlike her, had no means of escape. His family's survival depended on the very transaction he seemed so reluctant to complete. It was strange, she thought, how loneliness could exist on both ends of privilege and poverty alike, wearing different clothes, but carrying the same weight. Later that night, as she carried a small tray of warm milk up to Lady Margaret's room, a task the old woman insisted upon before sleep, she was intercepted in the corridor by Lady Vivian, who had clearly had more wine than was wise at dinner, and wore the flushed, careless confidence of someone eager to be cruel simply because she could. "Whitmore," Vivian said, blocking the narrow hallway with practiced ease. "Tell me, what do you make of Miss Hart? You have seen her, I assume, even from your little corners and hiding places." "I have not had the honor of a proper introduction, my lady," Alara said carefully. "No, of course not. Companions are not introduced to guests, are they? How dreadfully sad for you." Vivian's smile did not reach her eyes. "Still, you have eyes. Surely you have an opinion." "It is not my place to have opinions on such matters." "Everyone has opinions, Whitmore. They simply pretend otherwise when it is convenient." Vivian stepped closer, studying Alara's face with the same searching curiosity Lady Margaret had shown, though where the old woman's gaze had felt thoughtful, Vivian's felt predatory. "You have a strange way about you. Do you know that? You do not flinch the way the other servants do. You hold yourself, like someone who believes she deserves better than this hallway, this tray, this house even." Her smile sharpened. "I find that rather amusing, given your circumstances. I apologize if I have given offense, my lady. It was not my intention." "Oh, I am not offended." Vivian waved a dismissive hand, the wine making her movements slightly loose, slightly too honest. "I am simply curious what a woman like you was before poverty found her. You did not learn that posture scrubbing floors. I can promise you that much." She tilted her head. "No matter. Whatever you were, you are nothing now but a companion in my family's house. And I would advise you to remember that, especially this week of all weeks. We cannot afford any complications. Do you understand me? I understand perfectly, my lady, Elara said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Vivian studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside with an idle wave of her hand, already losing interest, her attention already drifting toward the sound of laughter coming from the drawing room below, where the Hart family and her brother remained deep in conversation. Elara continued on to Lady Margaret's room, her hands trembling slightly around the tray. Though whether from anger or exhaustion, she could not entirely say, she found the old woman awake and waiting, propped against her pillows, watching the door with those same sharp, pale eyes. You look troubled tonight, Lady Margaret observed, as Elara set down the tray and helped arrange the small table beside the bed. It has been a long day, my lady. I imagine it has. Lady Margaret took the cup of warm milk, wrapping both hands around it, though her grip was unsteady with age. My granddaughter has a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of her own importance. Do not let her cruelty cut too deep. It is born of fear more than malice, though I doubt she would ever admit as much. Elara blinked, surprised by the unexpected sympathy in the old woman's words. Fear of what, my lady? Fear of losing everything her family has left. Lady Margaret sipped the milk slowly, her gaze distant, fixed on some point beyond the walls of her room. This family is drowning, child, though we dress the drowning in fine silk and polished silver, to keep from admitting it aloud. My grandson's marriage to Miss Hart is not a romance. It is a rope thrown to a man going under. Vivian knows this as well as I do, and fear makes people cruel in ways kindness never could. Elara said nothing, though she felt something shift quietly inside her, a small crack in the wall of resentment she had been building against this household since the moment she arrived. She thought again of the man she had seen greeting the Hart family, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and wondered, not for the first time, what it must feel like to have one's entire future decided by the weight of a family's debts, rather than the wishes of one's own heart. You are quiet tonight, Lady Margaret said again, studying her companion with that same unsettling attentiveness. Quieter than usual, and that is saying something, given how little you speak even on ordinary days. I am only tired, my lady. Perhaps, the old woman did not sound convinced, but she let the matter rest, setting aside her empty cup and settling deeper into her pillows. Read to me a while longer before I sleep. The poetry, I think, something about longing suits the mood of this house tonight. Elara took up the worn volume and began to read in her low, steady voice, though her mind remained elsewhere, circling back, again and again, to the strange tangle of fear and cruelty and quiet desperation she had stumbled into. She thought of the broken vase and the wages she would lose for a crime she had not committed. She thought of Vivian's sharp words in the corridor and the old woman's unexpected sympathy only moments later. She thought, most of all, of the Duke himself, a man trapped by circumstance just as surely as she had once been trapped by hers, though neither of them yet understood how closely their two solitudes were about to collide. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and carrying with it the first cold breath of the coming winter. And somewhere far away, in a solicitor's office in London, a letter sealed with careful wax was already being handed to a writer bound for the countryside, carrying news that would soon make it impossible for Elara Whitmore to remain invisible any longer. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a rider whose horse was so lathered with sweat that the stable boy came running to fetch Mrs. Bell before the man had even dismounted. Elara heard the commotion from her small window and watched, curious, as the housekeeper hurried across the courtyard in her nightclothes, a shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, to receive a sealed envelope from the exhausted messenger. She thought nothing of it at the time. Urgent letters were common enough in a household so consumed by financial worry, and she had learned quickly that the business of the Ashcombe family moved in constant, anxious motion beneath the polished surface of daily life. She dressed, tied back her hair, and made her way up to Lady Margaret's room, as she did every morning, unaware that the letter now being carried through the house concerned her more directly than any other piece of correspondence that had ever crossed its threshold. Lady Margaret was unusually quiet that morning, watching Elara with an intensity that made the younger woman uneasy, though she could not say why. You slept poorly, Lady Margaret said, not quite a question. A little, my lady. The old woman's sharp eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, before she gestured toward the book on the side table. "Read to me. The history today, I think, not the poetry. My mind wants facts this morning, not feelings." Alara obliged, opening the heavy volume to where a faded ribbon marked their place, and began to read in her low, steady voice about the great trading families of the previous century, their ships and their fortunes, and the empires of commerce they had built across distant oceans. It was, she thought with some private irony, not so very different from the world her own father had inhabited, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as she read, giving no sign of the memories the words stirred. She did not notice, because she could not have known, that Lady Margaret was listening, not to the content of the history, but to something else entirely, something in the practiced ease with which Alara pronounced foreign port names, the way she understood without explanation the terms of trade and tariff that confused most educated readers. A companion hired from a modest advertisement should not read of maritime commerce with such quiet familiarity. Lady Margaret said nothing of her observation, but she filed it away carefully, the way she filed away every small inconsistency she had noticed since Alara's arrival. Meanwhile, in his study at the far end of the house, Duke Rowan Ashcombe sat with the letter open before him, his solicitor Mr. Grantham seated across the desk, his expression grave in the way of a man delivering news he knew would not be welcomed easily. "I do not understand why this concerns me," Rowan said, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. He had slept badly, his mind consumed by the calculations of debt and dowry that had governed every waking hour since his father's death 2 years prior. "A missing heiress in London is a matter for the courts, not for my household. Ordinarily, I would agree, Your Grace." Mr. Grantham adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward, but the young woman in question vanished under peculiar circumstances shortly before her father's estate was to be settled, and there is reason to believe she may have sought employment under a false name, precisely to avoid the fortune hunters circling her inheritance. Given the considerable size of that inheritance, several parties in London have taken a keen interest in locating her, myself among them, on behalf of a client with legitimate business interest in the estate's proper settlement. And you believe she may be here, in my house. Rowan's tone carried the flat disbelief of a man with far too many other problems to entertain fanciful speculation. "I believe it is possible, Your Grace, nothing more." The physical description provided matches several young women currently employed in households across the county, and I am obligated to make quiet inquiries wherever there is reasonable cause. "Your household recently engaged a new companion for Lady Margaret, did it not?" Rowan's jaw tightened, though more from irritation than genuine suspicion. "Miss Whitmore, a perfectly ordinary young woman, answering a perfectly ordinary advertisement. I hardly think a runaway heiress would choose to scrub floors and read poetry to an elderly woman, when she might instead be enjoying her fortune in comfort. Perhaps not, Your Grace, but stranger things have happened, and I would be remiss in my duties if I did not at least confirm the matter, quietly, and without disturbing your household unnecessarily." Mr. Grantham folded his hands. A simple conversation, discreetly arranged, would settle the question easily enough. Rowan waved a tired hand. "Do as you must, but do it quietly. I have quite enough complications in this house without adding a missing heiress to the list." His mind was already turning back to the more pressing matter of Cordelia Hart, whose family remained as his guests for the remainder of the week, and whose dowry represented the only realistic path toward saving the estate from the mounting debts that had haunted his family since his father's reckless investments years before. He did not think of Alara Whitmore again that morning, beyond a vague, distracted memory of the tea-stained dress and startled expression from their brief collision in the hallway days before. He had far greater concerns weighing on him, chief among them the delicate diplomatic dance he now had to perform with Mr. Hart, a man whose fortune he needed desperately, but whose company he found, if he was honest with himself, rather tedious. The Hart family had settled into the manor with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being welcomed everywhere they went, and by midday, Mrs. Hart had already reorganized the flower arrangements in the drawing room to her own taste, while Mr. Hart had taken to walking the grounds with Rowan each morning, discussing in great detail the improvements he intended to make once the marriage was settled, as though the outcome were already decided beyond question. "A man in your position needs a firm hand and clear direction," Mr. Hart said that morning, as the two men walked along the frost-covered garden paths, their breath visible in the cold air. I do not say this to criticize your grace, only to observe. This estate has excellent bones indeed, but it wants proper investment. Once Cordelia is settled here as your duchess, I intend to take a personal interest in restoring the property to its rightful glory. That is generous of you, Rowan said, in a tone that gave away nothing of his private discomfort at the phrase, your duchess, spoken with such casual certainty, about a woman he had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with in his entire life. Generosity has nothing to do with it, my boy. Mr. Hart clapped him firmly on the shoulder, a gesture Rowan found faintly irritating despite himself. Family looks after family, and once the papers are signed, that is precisely what we shall be, family. Rowan said nothing further, watching his breath cloud in the cold morning air, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that the entire course of his life had been reduced to a transaction discussed over frosty garden paths, as though he were a piece of property being appraised alongside the crumbling stonework of his own estate. Cordelia herself he found pleasant enough, though their few conversations left him with little sense of who she truly was, beneath the careful, practiced charm she displayed at every turn. She laughed at his jokes before he had quite finished telling them, agreed with every opinion he expressed, and steered every conversation, gently but persistently, toward the subject of the wedding, and the life they would supposedly build together, a life Rowan found himself unable to picture with any real clarity or enthusiasm. That afternoon, while the Hart family rested from their morning activities, Rowan retreated to his study, seeking a rare moment of solitude before the evening's obligations resumed. He found himself, unexpectedly, thinking again of the companion he had collided with in the hallway days before. There had been something in her eyes during that brief exchange, a kind of weary dignity he had not expected to find in a hired companion, something that reminded him, faintly and without explanation, of the way his own mother had once carried herself, before grief and duty had worn her down. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as foolish distraction. He had no time for idle curiosity about a stranger's eyes, when his family's entire future rested on the successful completion of a marriage he had not chosen, and did not particularly want. Elsewhere in the house, Elara spent the afternoon in the small sewing room, adjacent to Lady Margaret's chambers, mending a torn hem on one of the old woman's shawls, while half listening to the household gossip drifting in from the corridor. The staff spoke openly in front of her now, having decided, in the casual way of servants everywhere, that a companion occupied a strange middle ground, not quite family, not quite one of them, and therefore safe to speak freely around. The Hart family means to stay the full week, one of the housemaids was saying to another, as they carried fresh linens past the open sewing room door. Mrs. Bell says the wedding announcement may come before they leave, if all goes well. Poor Duke, the other maid replied, lowering her voice, though not quite enough to escape Elara's hearing. You can see it in his face, plain as day. He don't want this marriage any more than a man wants a tooth pulled, but what choice does he have, with the roof falling in and the tenants unpaid these 3 months past? Better a marriage of convenience than losing the whole estate, the first maid said, though her tone lacked full conviction. Still, it does seem a hard way to live, don't it? Choosing a wife, the way you'd choose a horse, for its breeding, rather than its temperament. The maids moved on down the corridor, their voices fading into the general hum of household activity, and Elara sat alone, with her needle and thread, turning their words over in her mind. She thought again of the tired, distant look she had seen in the Duke's eyes upon his brief greeting of the Hart family, and felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for a man whose circumstances, though vastly different from her own in wealth and position, seemed to mirror her own in one crucial respect. Neither of them had been permitted to choose their own path forward. Both had been caught in the crushing machinery of fortune and obligation, one running from a marriage forced upon her by wealth, the other trapped by a marriage demanded by its absence. She finished the mending and returned the shawl to Lady Margaret's room, where she found the old woman engaged in quiet conversation with Mr. Grantham, the family solicitor, their voices dropping to a murmur the moment Elara entered. "Ah, Miss Whitmore," Lady Margaret said, her tone carefully casual, in a way that immediately raised Elara's guard. "Mr. Grantham was just leaving. Were you not, sir?" "Indeed, my lady." Mr. Grantham rose, gathering his papers with deliberate slowness, his eyes flicking toward Elara, with an interest that felt, to her sudden discomfort, far too pointed to be accidental. A pleasure to see you again, Miss Whitmore. I trust you are settling well into your position here. Yes, sir, thank you, Alara said, though something in his tone sent a cold thread of unease down her spine. Mr. Grantham held her gaze a moment longer than the exchange required, then bowed politely and took his leave, his footsteps fading down the corridor with unhurried precision. Alara turned to find Lady Margaret watching her with those same sharp, unreadable eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt something close to genuine fear stir beneath her careful composure. "Is something wrong, my lady?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Wrong?" Lady Margaret's expression gave away nothing at all. "No, child, nothing is wrong. Mr. Grantham simply had some tedious business to discuss regarding the family accounts. Nothing that concerns you." She reached for the book on her side table, her movements slow and deliberate. "Come, read to me a while. The history again, I think. I found this morning's chapter unexpectedly interesting." Alara took up the book with hands that trembled just slightly, though she kept her voice steady as she resumed reading, unaware that Lady Margaret's sharp eyes remained fixed not on the page before them, but on the quiet, careful woman reading it aloud, watching for every small detail that might confirm the suspicion, now taking firm root in the old woman's clever, patient mind. Outside, the afternoon light faded early into the gray hush of a countryside winter approaching, and somewhere in the depths of the house, Mr. Grantham sat down at a borrowed writing desk to compose a careful letter to his client in London, one that would soon set in motion events neither Alara nor the Duke could yet imagine, events that would strip away every careful disguise and force the truth into the light, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Mr. Grantham did not sleep that night. He sat at the borrowed writing desk in the small guest chamber Mrs. Bell had arranged for him, a single candle burning low beside a stack of correspondence, and composed his letter to London with the careful precision of a man who understood that a single misstep could cost him a client's considerable trust. He wrote of the new companion's unusual bearing, her educated manner of speech, the way she pronounced the names of foreign ports without hesitation during her morning readings to Lady Margaret. He wrote of her arrival timeline, which matched almost exactly the disappearance of the missing heiress from London society. He wrote, most carefully of all, of Lady Margaret's own growing suspicion, which the old woman had confided to him in strictest confidence that very afternoon. "I believe I know who she is," Lady Margaret had said, her voice low, even though the two of them sat alone in her chamber. "I cannot yet prove it, but a woman does not forget certain things, even in her old age. I attended the christening of Alara Ashworth myself, many years ago, when her father's ships had only just begun their rise to prominence. The girl who reads to me now has her mother's eyes, exactly, down to the particular shade of gray that shifts toward green in candlelight." "You are certain, my lady." "I am certain of nothing, Mr. Grantham, which is precisely why I have said nothing to my grandson." Lady Margaret's expression had grown thoughtful, almost calculating. "But I intend to watch, and to wait, and to see how this household treats a woman it believes to be nothing more than a hired companion, before that woman's true worth becomes known to everyone under this roof. There is value in such an experiment, do you not think? It tells us a great deal about the character of the people involved." Mr. Grantham had understood the old woman's meaning immediately, and something in her request had struck him as both wise and faintly cruel, though he had agreed to keep his own inquiries quiet for the time being, sending his letter to London not as confirmation, but as careful speculation, awaiting further instruction from his client before taking any definitive action. He sealed the letter with wax and handed it to a rider before dawn the following morning, then returned to his own quiet observation of the household, watching with new interest the small interactions between the family and the woman they all believed to be simply Miss Whitmore, the companion. Alara, unaware of the letter now traveling swiftly toward London, spent the following days in the familiar rhythm of her duties, though an uneasy feeling had settled over her since her strange encounter with Mr. Grantham in Lady Margaret's chamber. She could not say precisely why his gaze had unsettled her so deeply, only that some instinct, honed by weeks of careful concealment, told her to be more cautious than ever. The Hart family remained at the manor, their visit stretching into its 4th day, and the household continued its delicate dance of forced hospitality and quiet financial desperation. Alara observed it all from the edges of rooms, invisible in the way companions were meant to be invisible, and found herself, despite her better judgment, increasingly drawn to observing the Duke himself, whose quiet unhappiness seemed to grow more visible with each passing day, at least to eyes willing to look closely enough to see it. She saw him one afternoon standing alone at the edge of the frost-covered garden, staring out toward the distant hills with an expression of such profound exhaustion that she nearly forgot herself and approached him, before remembering her place and retreating quietly back into the house instead. She saw him again that evening, seated at the head of the long dining table, nodding along to Mr. Hart's endless stories of business triumphs, while his eyes remained distant, fixed on some point far beyond the room itself. It was not romantic curiosity that drew her attention, or so she told herself firmly. It was simply recognition, the particular kind that exists between two people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Even if those circumstances wore vastly different faces, she, too, understood what it meant to have one's future decided by forces entirely outside personal choice. She, too, understood the particular loneliness of standing in a crowded room, while feeling utterly and completely alone. On the fifth day, disaster arrived, in a form Alara had not anticipated, though perhaps she should have. She was carrying a stack of freshly laundered linens up the main staircase, having been asked to assist the overworked housemaids given the demands of hosting guests, when she rounded a corner too quickly and nearly collided again with the very man she had been trying so carefully to avoid noticing. Rowan caught her arm to steady her, before the linens could scatter across the polished floor, and for a brief moment, their eyes met at close distance, close enough that Alara noticed, with an unwelcome flutter of awareness, the particular shade of gray in his eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion around them that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. "We seem destined to collide, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a faint, weary attempt at humor. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I did not see you. No harm done, though I confess, I am beginning to wonder if this staircase has some particular grudge against us both." He released her arm, and something in his gaze lingered a moment longer than strict propriety allowed, before he seemed to catch himself and step back, his expression returning to its careful, guarded neutrality. "Lady Margaret speaks highly of your reading. She has grown rather fond of your company, which is no small accomplishment. She is not an easy woman to please." "She has been very kind to me, Your Grace," Alara said, surprised by the sincerity of the compliment. "Kind is not a word often applied to my grandmother," Rowan said, and this time a faint, genuine smile touched his mouth, the first real expression of warmth Alara had seen from him since her arrival. "I am glad to hear it, whatever the reason. This house could use a little more kindness in it these days." There was something in the way he said it, a weariness beneath the words that suggested far more than simple politeness, and Alara found herself, against every instinct of caution, responding honestly, rather than with the careful deference expected of her position. "Forgive me for saying so, Your Grace, but you seem burdened." The words hung between them for a moment, and Alara immediately regretted the boldness of them, certain she had overstepped whatever narrow boundary existed between a companion and the master of the house. But Rowan did not react with the offense she expected. Instead, something in his careful composure seemed to crack, just slightly, and he studied her with an expression of genuine surprise. "That is a remarkably direct observation for someone in your position," he said, though there was no anger in his tone, only a kind of tired curiosity. "I apologize, Your Grace. It was not my place to speak so." "No," he said slowly. "Perhaps it was not. And yet you are correct. All the same." He glanced down the empty corridor, as though checking for listening ears, then lowered his voice slightly. "I am burdened, Miss Whitmore, more than I would care to admit to anyone in this house, family included. It is a strange thing, to have an entire estate depend on the success of a marriage one did not choose, to a woman one barely knows, simply because the alternative is watching everything one's family has built for generations crumble into ruin." Alara said nothing, but something in her expression must have conveyed understanding, because Rowan continued, almost as though speaking to himself as much as to her. "I do not say this to burden you with my troubles, Miss Whitmore. It is simply rare, in this house, to encounter someone who does not want something from me, who does not calculate every conversation for its usefulness toward some larger scheme." He shook his head slightly, as though surprised by his own candor. "You must think me foolish, confiding such things to a companion I have exchanged perhaps 3 conversations with in total." "I do not think you foolish, Your Grace," Alara said quietly. I think you sound like someone who has not had the luxury of speaking honestly in a very long time. Rowan's eyes met hers again, and this time, the surprise in his expression was unmistakable, mixed with something else Ilara could not quite name, something that made her heart beat a little too quickly for comfort. You are an unusual companion, Miss Whitmore, he said finally. So I have been told, Your Grace. A faint smile touched his mouth again, and for a moment, the weight he carried seemed to lift, just slightly, replaced by something almost like genuine warmth. But the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed, interrupted by the sound of Lady Vivian's voice, calling from the bottom of the staircase, sharp and impatient. Rowan! Miss Hart is asking for you in the drawing room. She wishes to discuss the garden party arrangements before her family departs. Rowan's expression closed again, the walls rising back into place with practiced ease, and he stepped back from Ilara with a small, formal nod. I must go. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Whitmore. It is rarer than you might imagine, in a house such as this. He descended the staircase without another word, leaving Ilara standing alone with her armful of linens and a strange, unsettling warmth blooming in her chest, one she immediately tried to suppress with firm reminders of her own circumstances. She was a woman in hiding, disguised as a companion, with no future here beyond the completion of her contracted season. Whatever brief connection had passed between them in that quiet corridor meant nothing, could mean nothing, and she scolded herself firmly for allowing even a moment's foolish hope to take root. She did not know, as she carried the linens the rest of the way up the staircase and resumed her duties, that Lady Vivian had witnessed the tail end of their conversation from the landing above, her sharp eyes narrowing with sudden, suspicious interest at the sight of her brother speaking so intently with a mere companion, his expression softer than she had seen it in weeks. Nor did she know that in London, Mr. Grantham's letter had already reached its intended recipient, a sharp-eyed lawyer named Mr. Ellery Finch, who had spent the better part of 2 months searching for precisely the young woman Grantham now believed he had located. Finch read the letter twice, his expression growing increasingly intent with each line, before rising immediately to arrange his own journey to the countryside, carrying with him documents that would confirm, beyond any doubt, the true identity of the woman currently known throughout Ashcombe Manor as nothing more than Lady Margaret's quiet, humble companion. The week was only half finished, and already the careful disguise Ilara had built for herself was beginning to crack at its edges, though she remained blissfully unaware of just how quickly the truth was closing in, carried forward by letters and lawyers, and the sharp, watchful eyes of an old woman who had already guessed far more than anyone in the household yet realized. Lady Vivian did not sleep well that night, turning over in her mind the image of her brother's softened expression as he spoke with the companion in the corridor. She told herself it meant nothing, that Rowan was simply a man under pressure seeking a moment's distraction from the weight of his obligations, but the image lingered regardless, sharp and unwelcome, until she rose before dawn with a plan already forming in her calculating mind. She found Ilara in the small sewing room early that morning, mending a torn curtain from one of the guest chambers, and settled herself into the chair opposite with the deliberate ease of someone preparing for a confrontation she had already decided she would win. You spoke with my brother yesterday, Vivian said, without preamble. Ilara's needle paused for only a moment before continuing its steady rhythm. He asked after Lady Margaret's health, my lady. I answered as befits my position. That is not what I saw. Vivian's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, though something sharp glittered beneath the surface. I saw my brother smiling, Whitmore, actually smiling, in a way he has not managed once during this entire visit from the Hart family. I find that rather curious, given that you are nothing more than our grandmother's hired companion. I did nothing to encourage such familiarity, my lady. If the Duke found a moment of ease in our brief exchange, I cannot account for his reasons. Cannot account for them, or will not. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. Let me be plain with you, Whitmore, since you seem to require plainness. My brother's marriage to Miss Hart is not a matter of preference. It is a matter of survival. This family will lose everything, the estate, the title's dignity, the tenants who depend on us for their livelihoods, if that marriage does not proceed as planned. I will not have some passing fancy for a companion's pretty eyes threaten what little security remains to us. Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from anger or embarrassment she could not entirely say. I assure you, my lady, I have no designs whatsoever on the Duke's attention. I am aware of my position in this household, and I have no intention of forgetting it. See that you remember it then. Vivian rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her gown with practiced grace. I would hate for a hard-working companion to find herself suddenly without a position, particularly one who has already cost this household the price of a broken vase. Her tone remained pleasant throughout, which made the threat somehow more chilling than if she had shouted it outright. Miss Hart's family departs in 3 days, and I intend for the wedding announcement to be made before they leave. Do not give me any reason to think you an obstacle to that outcome, Whitmore. I would not enjoy having to explain your dismissal to my grandmother, but I would manage it easily enough if the need arose. She left the sewing room without waiting for a response, her silk skirts whispering against the floor, and Alara sat alone with her mending, her hands trembling slightly around the needle, despite her best efforts at composure. She thought of her father, of the quiet, principled way he had always conducted his business affairs, refusing to bully those beneath him, even when his own fortune gave him every advantage to do so. She thought of how far she had fallen from that world, reduced now to enduring threats from a spoiled young woman who held power over her simply by virtue of birth and circumstance. But she also thought, with a small flicker of stubborn defiance she could not entirely suppress, that Vivienne's threats, however unpleasant, changed nothing about her own resolve. She had not come to Ashcombe Manor seeking romance or complication. She had come seeking peace, and she intended to see her contracted season through to its end, regardless of Lady Vivian's suspicions, or the strange, unwelcome warmth she had felt during her brief conversation with the Duke. The days that followed brought a fresh wave of small cruelties, each one seemingly minor on its own, but accumulating steadily into something heavier and more wearing. Mrs. Bell, perhaps sensing Vivian's displeasure and eager to align herself with the family's favor, began assigning Alara additional duties beyond her contracted responsibilities, tasks meant for housemaids rather than companions, scrubbing floors in the lesser-used chambers, carrying heavy loads of firewood up the narrow servant stairs, mending torn linens late into the evening after her duties to Lady Margaret were already complete. Alara performed each task without complaint, though the physical exhaustion began to wear on her in ways the emotional strain alone had not. She found herself falling asleep some nights still in her day clothes, too tired even to change, before collapsing onto her narrow bed, only to be woken again before dawn by the same demanding rhythm of servitude. At meals, she was given the coldest portions, served last after the rest of the staff had already eaten their fill, the remnants scraped together with little care for whether they were fresh or properly warmed. She said nothing, ate what was given without complaint, and told herself it was temporary, a brief trial to be endured before her contracted season ended, and she could move on to a quieter, gentler situation elsewhere. Lady Margaret, however, noticed everything, watching the small cruelties accumulate with the same sharp attentiveness she had shown since Alara's very first morning in her service. She said nothing directly to Alara about what she observed, but her questions during their morning readings grew increasingly pointed, testing the boundaries of her companion's composure in ways that felt, to Alara, less like idle curiosity and more like careful investigation. "You bear difficulty well," Lady Margaret observed one morning, as Alara moved stiffly to retrieve the book from its shelf, her body aching from the previous night's heavy labor. "Better than most in your position would manage, I think." "I have learned that complaint rarely improves circumstances, my lady," Alara replied carefully. "An admirable philosophy, though an unusual one for someone raised, I suspect, without much practice in hardship." Lady Margaret's pale eyes studied her closely. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, where did you learn to bear yourself with such quiet dignity? It is not a skill easily taught to those born into genuine poverty. Poverty tends to teach desperation, not grace." Alara's heart skipped uncomfortably, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I have simply tried to conduct myself properly, my lady, regardless of circumstance." Lady Margaret did not press further, though her gaze lingered a moment longer than comfortable, before she gestured toward the book. "Read to me, then. The history, where we left off yesterday. I find myself increasingly curious about the fate of those old trading families, the ones whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides of distant oceans." Alara read as instructed, her voice steady despite the growing unease building beneath her calm exterior. She could not shake the feeling that Lady Margaret's questions were leading somewhere specific, though she could not yet guess precisely where, and the uncertainty gnawed at her throughout the remainder of the day. That evening, exhausted from another long day of double duties, Ilara retreated to her small room, only to find, waiting on her narrow bed, a folded note bearing no signature. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, half expecting some fresh cruelty from Lady Vivienne, only to find instead a short, carefully written message in an unfamiliar hand. Meet me in the garden after the household retires. There is a matter I must discuss with you privately, one that concerns your welfare, and cannot wait until morning. There was no name attached, and Ilara stared at the note for a long while, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. She considered ignoring the summons entirely, retreating instead, into the safety of her locked door and the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. But curiosity and a nagging sense of unease finally won out, and well after midnight, once the household had settled into silence, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped quietly out through the servants' entrance into the cold, moonlit garden. She found Mr. Grantham waiting near the old stone fountain at the garden's center, his expression grave in the pale light, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly as she approached, "thank you for coming. I would not have asked such a thing of you lightly, but the matter at hand does not permit delay." "What is this about, sir?" Ilara asked, though something cold had already settled in her stomach, an instinctive recognition that whatever came next would change everything. "I believe you know precisely what this is about, Miss Whitmore," Mr. Grantham said gently, opening the leather folder to reveal a portrait sketch, faded but unmistakable, of a young woman whose face bore an unmistakable resemblance to the one standing before him now in the moonlight. Or should I say, Miss Ashworth? The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath Ilara's feet, and for a long, silent moment she could not find any words at all, standing frozen in the cold garden air, with the weight of her carefully guarded secret finally, inevitably, coming undone. "You are mistaken," Ilara said, though her voice betrayed her, thin and unsteady in the cold night air. "My name is Whitmore. Miss Whitmore, please." Mr. Grantham's tone remained gentle, patient, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime coaxing difficult truths from reluctant clients. "I mean you no harm. I promise you this. I represent your father's estate, and I have spent nearly 2 months searching for his rightful heir, growing increasingly concerned with each passing week that some misfortune had befallen you. Finding you here, alive and well, is a relief beyond what I can properly express." Ilara stared at the sketch in his hands, her own face looking back at her from a piece of paper she had never seen before. Drawn, she realized with a jolt of memory, by an artist her father had commissioned years ago for a formal portrait she had always found faintly embarrassing in its flattery. "How did you find me?" she asked finally, her composure cracking under the weight of exhaustion, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of no longer needing to maintain her careful disguise, at least in this one small moment, with this one careful stranger. "Your manner of speech, your bearing, your evident education in matters of trade and commerce, all of it drew Lady Margaret's attention first, and through her, mine." Mr. Grantham closed the leather folder carefully. "She suspected almost from your very first morning in this house, though she has said nothing to her grandson or granddaughter, preferring instead to observe how this family treated a woman they believed to be nothing more than a hired companion." Ilara felt a fresh wave of unease at this revelation. "She has known all along?" "Suspected, Miss Ashworth, though I believe her suspicion has hardened into near certainty over these past days." Mr. Grantham's expression grew more serious. "I must ask you directly, and I hope you will forgive the bluntness of the question given the circumstances. Are you Ilara Ashworth, only daughter of the late Charles Ashworth, and sole heir to his trading fortune?" The question hung in the cold night air between them, and Ilara found herself, after weeks of careful concealment, suddenly and completely unable to continue the lie any longer, not to this man, who had clearly already gathered enough evidence to know the truth regardless of her answer, and not to herself, exhausted as she was from carrying the weight of a false name through every difficult hour of the past week. "Yes," she said quietly, "I am Ilara Ashworth." Mr. Grantham let out a long breath, something like relief passing across his features. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Ashworth. I understand, believe me, why you sought to disappear from society following your father's death. The circling of fortune hunters around a young, unmarried heiress is a predictable and often ruthless business, and I do not fault you for seeking refuge from it. What happens now? Ilara asked, her mind already racing ahead to the practical consequences of her exposure. The loss of the quiet anonymity she had fought so hard to secure. The return of every unwelcome suitor and calculating relative she had fled from in the first place. That depends a great deal on what you wish to happen, Miss Ashworth. Mr. Grantham's tone grew gentle again. Legally, your father's estate cannot be fully settled without your presence and signature on certain documents. There are matters of inheritance, of business continuity, of tenant welfare on properties your father owned, all of which require your attention sooner rather than later. But how you choose to proceed from here, whether publicly or with continued discretion, remains entirely your decision to make. Ilara wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the cold, her thoughts a tangled mess of relief and fresh anxiety. Does the Duke know? The question slipped out before she could fully consider its implications, and something in Mr. Grantham's expression shifted slightly, curious and considering, though he answered honestly. Not yet, Miss Ashworth, though I suspect it will not remain a secret for very much longer. Lady Margaret's suspicions grow stronger daily, and I do not believe she intends to keep this knowledge from her family indefinitely. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. May I ask why the Duke's knowledge concerns you particularly? Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold night air, embarrassed by the question and the feelings it forced her to acknowledge, even briefly, to herself. It does not concern me particularly, sir. I simply wish to understand the full scope of who already knows the truth, given the delicate position I find myself in. Mr. Grantham studied her for a long moment, and though he said nothing further on the subject, something in his careful expression suggested he had drawn his own conclusions regardless of her denial. For now, I would ask only that you continue your duties as normal, without alteration, while I consult further with Lady Margaret on how best to proceed. A sudden revelation, handled poorly, could create considerable complication, both for your own comfort and for the family's delicate financial negotiations currently underway with the Hart family. Ilara nodded, though the mention of the Hart family sent an unexpected pang through her chest, one she immediately tried to suppress. Of course, sir. I will say nothing. Thank you, Miss Ashworth. And please, do try to rest. You look exhausted, and rightfully so, given everything you have endured this past week. Mr. Grantham gave a small, respectful bow, then withdrew into the shadows of the garden, leaving Ilara alone beside the old stone fountain, staring up at the cold, distant stars scattered across the winter sky. She returned to her small room in a daze, her mind churning through the implications of what had just transpired. The careful disguise she had built for herself, the anonymity she had fought so hard to maintain, was already crumbling, and soon, she knew, the entire household would learn precisely who she truly was. She thought of Lady Vivian's sharp cruelty, of Mrs. Bell's cold indifference, of the doubled labor and coldest meals she had endured in silence these past days, and wondered, with a bitter twist of irony, how differently this household might have treated her, had they known from the very beginning the true size of the fortune hidden beneath her plain gray dresses. She thought, too, of Duke Rowan Ashcombe, of the brief, unexpected warmth in his eyes during their conversation in the corridor, of his tired confession about the weight of his obligations. Would he look at her differently once he learned the truth? Would his sudden interest in her company reveal itself as nothing more than the same calculating fortune hunting she had fled from in London, dressed up in a kinder, gentler disguise? The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit, and she lay awake long into the night turning it over in her exhausted mind, unable to find any comfortable resolution. Meanwhile, in her own chamber at the far end of the house, Lady Margaret sat awake as well, having received a quiet report from Mr. Grantham, upon his return from the garden, confirming what she had already suspected for days. She stared into the dying embers of her fire, her sharp mind working through the implications with the same careful calculation that had guided her through decades of managing her family's fortunes and misfortunes alike. She thought of her grandson, burdened and exhausted, trapped in a marriage of convenience that promised financial salvation but little genuine happiness. She thought of her granddaughter, sharp-tongued and fearful beneath her cruelty, desperate to secure whatever stability she could for a family teetering on the edge of ruin. And she thought of the quiet, dignified young woman who had endured a week of scorn and hardship without once revealing the true scope of the fortune she carried, choosing instead to bear every small cruelty with patient grace. A plan began forming in Lady Margaret's mind, careful and deliberate, one that would require patience and a willingness to let events unfold a little further before revealing the truth to her family. She wanted to see, with her own eyes, exactly how her grandson and granddaughter would treat this remarkable young woman once the full truth emerged, whether their affection or apology would prove genuine, or merely another calculated grab at fortune, no different from the ruthless suitors Elara had fled from in the first place. She rang the small bell beside her bed, summoning the night maid, and gave quiet instructions for Mr. Grantham to attend her again first thing in the morning. There was much still to arrange, and precious little time remaining before the truth, inevitably, forced its way into the light. Outside, the winter wind picked up once more, rattling the old windows of Ashcombe Manor, carrying with it the unmistakable sense that everything within its walls was about to change, irrevocably and completely, for every soul who called it home. Morning brought a fresh chill to the manor, and with it, a strange new tension that Elara could not quite name, but felt pressing against her from every direction. Lady Margaret greeted her with the same sharp, watchful eyes as always, though something in the old woman's manner had shifted subtly overnight, a kind of quiet purpose that had not been present before. "You look tired," Lady Margaret observed, as Elara settled into her usual chair beside the bed. "I did not sleep well, my lady." "No, I imagine not." Lady Margaret's tone gave nothing away, though her gaze lingered on Elara's face with unusual intensity. "There is to be a small dinner tonight, before the Hart family's departure tomorrow. My grandson intends to make a formal announcement of his engagement to Miss Hart. I trust you will be present to assist with the arrangements, as companions often are on such occasions." Elara's stomach twisted uncomfortably at the news, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, my lady. Whatever assistance is required." "Good." Lady Margaret settled back against her pillows, her expression unreadable. "It should prove a most interesting evening, I think, for all involved." Elara did not understand the strange emphasis in the old woman's words, and she had little time to ponder it further, as the day's preparations quickly consumed every available hour. Mrs. Bell drove the household staff into a frenzy of polishing and arranging, determined that the evening's dinner should proceed without a single flaw to mar the Duke's formal announcement. Elara found herself assigned to yet another round of demanding tasks, arranging flowers, polishing silver, assisting the overworked kitchen staff with preparations for a meal far grander than anything the manor had produced in recent memory. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, though she pressed forward regardless, determined not to let her fatigue show in front of the assembled family and guests. She helped carry the final dishes to the dining room, just as the family and their guests began taking their seats, and lingered near the doorway, ready to assist should any need arise during the meal, as was expected of a companion in her position. The dining room glowed with candlelight, every surface gleaming with the careful polish of the day's labor, and Elara watched from her quiet vantage point as Duke Rowan Ashcombe took his place at the head of the table, Miss Cordelia Hart seated at his right hand, her expression bright with anticipation. Mr. and Mrs. Hart sat nearby, beaming with barely contained satisfaction, while Lady Vivian occupied the seat closest to her brother, watching the proceedings with sharp, calculating eyes. Lady Margaret, too frail for a full evening at the table, had been brought down in a wheeled chair to observe the announcement, positioned near the head of the table, where she could watch every face clearly, and Elara noticed, with growing unease, that the old woman's gaze kept drifting toward her, rather than toward the engaged couple at the center of attention. The meal proceeded through several courses, filled with polite conversation and careful toasts to the health and happiness of the assembled families, though Elara noticed, watching closely from her position near the wall, that Rowan's expression remained carefully composed, rather than genuinely joyful, his smiles measured and correct, but lacking the warmth she had glimpsed so briefly during their conversation in the corridor days before. It was during the dessert course that disaster struck, though not in any manner Elara could have anticipated. Lady Vivian, emboldened perhaps by wine and the satisfaction of her family's impending financial rescue, turned her sharp attention toward the doorway where Elara stood, and addressed her directly in front of the assembled guests. "Whitmore," Vivian called out, her voice carrying easily across the room, drawing every eye toward the quiet companion standing near the wall. "Come here a moment. I wish to make a point to our guests." Ilara approached cautiously, her heart sinking at the sudden, unwanted attention, though she had no choice but to comply. "Yes, my lady." "Miss Hart," Vivian said, turning toward Cordelia with a bright, false smile, "allow me to demonstrate something rather amusing about the nature of hired help in this household. Whitmore here arrived only a week ago, and already she has managed to break a priceless family heirloom, requiring the deduction of nearly a month's wages to cover the cost." She turned back toward Ilara, her expression sharpening with cruel satisfaction. "Is that not correct, Whitmore?" The room fell silent, every eye now fixed on Ilara, who felt heat rise painfully in her cheeks at the public humiliation being orchestrated before her. She knew, of course, that she had not broken the vase, that the household's own maid had witnessed the family cat knock it over, hours before Ilara had even passed through that corridor. But to argue the point now, in front of guests and family alike, would only invite further cruelty and complication. "Yes, my lady," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. "You see," Vivian continued, addressing the table at large with the satisfied air of someone delivering a clever lesson, "one must always watch closely when bringing strangers into one's household, however humble their position. Even the quietest, most unassuming companion can prove costly if not properly supervised." She laughed lightly, and several guests joined in with polite, uncomfortable chuckles, though Mr. Hart's laugh carried a slightly harder edge, as though he found some genuine amusement in the servant's humiliation. Ilara stood frozen near the head of the table, humiliation burning through her chest, and for one brief, dangerous moment, she considered speaking the full truth aloud, of revealing precisely who she was, and the full weight of the fortune she carried, simply to silence Vivian's cruel amusement once and for all. But she caught herself before the words could escape, remembering Mr. Grantham's careful instructions to maintain her disguise a little longer, and instead simply lowered her eyes further, waiting for the moment of public scrutiny to pass. It was Rowan, unexpectedly, who broke the uncomfortable silence that followed. "Vivienne," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine irritation that surprised the assembled guests. "That is quite enough. Miss Whitmore has served this household diligently, and I see no reason to embarrass her further in front of our guests." Vivian's expression flickered with surprise at her brother's unexpected defense, though she recovered quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "I only meant to illustrate a point, brother. There is no need to be so sensitive on behalf of a hired companion." "Nonetheless," Rowan said, his tone firm, "I would ask that we return to more pleasant subjects for the remainder of the evening." He glanced briefly toward Ilara, and something in his expression, a flicker of genuine apology, passed between them before he turned back toward the table and resumed the conversation with Mr. Hart, steering the discussion firmly away from the uncomfortable moment. Ilara withdrew from the dining room as quickly as propriety allowed, retreating to the relative safety of the corridor outside, where she leaned against the cold stone wall and took several steadying breaths, willing the burning humiliation in her chest to subside. She had endured a week of small cruelties without complaint, but this public humiliation, delivered so casually and deliberately in front of an audience, struck her differently, cutting deeper than she had expected. She did not notice, standing alone in the shadowed corridor, that Lady Margaret had wheeled her chair quietly away from the dining table and positioned herself near the doorway, watching the entire exchange with sharp, calculating attention. The old woman had seen everything: her granddaughter's cruel display, her grandson's unexpected defense, and Ilara's quiet, dignified suffering throughout, and something in her expression suggested the evening's events had provided exactly the confirmation she had been quietly seeking. "You handled that with remarkable grace," came a quiet voice from behind Ilara, and she turned, startled, to find Rowan had followed her from the dining room, his expression carrying an unmistakable weight of guilt and concern. "Thank you, Your Grace, though I confess, I did not feel particularly graceful in the moment." "My sister's behavior was inexcusable," Rowan said, his jaw tight, with barely contained frustration. "I should have intervened sooner. I am sorry you were made to endure such treatment, particularly in front of guests who had no business witnessing it. You need not apologize on your sister's behalf, Your Grace. It is not your burden to carry." "Perhaps not," Rowan said, "but I find myself carrying it regardless." He studied her for a long moment, his expression softening into something Ilara found difficult to categorize: warmth mixed with genuine concern, entirely unlike the calculated politeness he had shown toward Cordelia Hart throughout the evening's proceedings. "You have endured a great deal since your arrival here, Miss Whitmore. More than I think anyone in this household has properly acknowledged. I am sorry for that, sincerely." Alara felt her carefully maintained composure wavering under the weight of his unexpected kindness, and she found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, responding honestly. "It has been a difficult week, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise. But I have endured worse, in different circumstances, and I will endure this as well." "What circumstances?" Rowan asked, his curiosity clearly genuine, rather than merely polite. Alara hesitated, aware that she stood on the very edge of revealing far more than she should, given Mr. Grantham's careful instructions. "That is a story for another time, Your Grace, if you will forgive me for saying so." Rowan studied her a moment longer, clearly sensing there was more beneath the surface of her careful deflection, but he did not press further. "Of course. Forgive my intrusion. I only wished to ensure you were well after such an unpleasant scene." He nodded, though he lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary, before finally taking his leave, returning to the dining room, and the fiancé waiting for his attention there, leaving Alara alone once more in the quiet corridor, her heart racing with confusion and an unwelcome warmth she could not entirely suppress, no matter how firmly she reminded herself of the impossible distance between her current disguise and the truth that would soon, inevitably, unravel everything. Behind the dining room doors, Lady Margaret watched her grandson return to his seat beside Cordelia Hart, noting the careful, correct smile he offered his intended bride, so different from the genuine warmth she had glimpsed in his expression only moments before in the corridor. The old woman's suspicions, already strong, hardened further into something like certainty, and she resolved, quietly and deliberately, that the time for her careful test was drawing to its natural conclusion. The truth could not remain hidden much longer, and she found herself increasingly curious to see what would happen when it finally, inevitably, came to light. The final morning of the Hart family's visit arrived with an unexpected complication that no one at Ashcombe Manor had anticipated. A carriage arrived shortly after breakfast, unannounced, carrying an old family friend of the Ashcombes, a widowed gentleman named Lord Edmund Fairfax, who had travelled from London to pay his respects to Lady Margaret and discuss a matter of mutual investment interest with the Duke. Lord Fairfax was a man well connected in London society, having spent decades cultivating relationships across the trading and banking circles that governed much of the country's commercial life, and he arrived at the manor in good spirits, eager to share news of recent developments in the city, before settling down to business with Rowan. He was shown into the drawing room, where the family and their departing guests had gathered for a final morning of pleasant conversation before the Hart family's carriages were loaded for the journey home, and it was there, quite by accident, that the careful disguise Alara had maintained for an entire week finally, irrevocably, collapsed. Alara had been asked to bring in a fresh pot of tea, a task ordinarily beneath a companion's usual duties, but assigned to her that morning, due to the general shortage of staff amid the departure preparations. She entered the drawing room quietly, carrying the tray with practiced care, intending to set it down and withdraw as unobtrusively as possible, exactly as she had done throughout her entire stay at the manor. But Lord Fairfax, mid-conversation with Lady Margaret, happened to glance toward the doorway just as Alara entered, and his words trailed off into stunned silence, his expression shifting rapidly from polite attention to open, unmistakable astonishment. "Good heavens," he said, rising abruptly from his chair, his eyes fixed on Alara, with an intensity that made the entire room fall silent. "It cannot be. Miss Ashworth? Alara Ashworth?" The tray in Alara's hands trembled slightly, and for a long, frozen moment, no one in the room moved or spoke, the sudden weight of Lord Fairfax's recognition settling over the gathering like a physical presence. Alara felt every eye turned toward her, confusion and dawning suspicion spreading across the faces of Lady Vivian, the Hart family, and finally, most devastatingly, Rowan himself. "I beg your pardon," Rowan said slowly, his gaze moving between Lord Fairfax and Alara with growing bewilderment. "Edmund, surely you are mistaken. This is Miss Whitmore, my grandmother's companion." "I am not mistaken in the slightest," Lord Fairfax said firmly, crossing the room to stand before Alara, studying her face with the careful attention of a man confirming a memory he trusted absolutely. I attended her father's dinner table on more occasions than I can properly count. Charles Ashworth's daughter had a portrait commissioned only 2 years past, one that hung prominently in his London townhouse for all his guests to admire. I would know this face anywhere, Rowan, regardless of the name she has apparently chosen to go by. He turned toward Alara directly, his expression softening with genuine concern. My dear girl, whatever has brought you to disguise yourself as a common companion? The entire trading community of London has been in an uproar over your disappearance these past 2 months. Your father's solicitors have been searching everywhere for you. The tray finally slipped from Alara's trembling hands, and only Lord Fairfax's quick reflexes prevented the tea service from shattering across the drawing-room floor. She stood frozen, every carefully maintained defense finally crumbling away entirely, and found herself, for the first time in weeks, utterly unable to speak a single word in her own defense. Is this true? Lady Vivian's voice cut sharply through the silence, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to something far more dangerous, a mixture of humiliation and rising anger. Whitmore, is this true? Are you truly the missing heiress everyone in London has been searching for? Alara closed her eyes for a moment, gathering what remained of her scattered composure, before finally speaking the truth aloud for the first time to the assembled household. Yes, she said quietly. My true name is Alara Ashworth. I took the name Whitmore to escape the fortune hunters who besieged me following my father's death. I meant no deception toward this family, beyond the simple wish to be left in peace. The silence that followed felt heavier than any that had come before, and Alara watched, with a strange, detached clarity, as the truth settled over each face in the room in turn. Mr. Hart's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to something like calculating alarm, clearly beginning to understand the magnitude of the fortune that had been living quietly among them, disguised in plain gray dresses. Mrs. Hart's hand flew to her mouth in genuine shock. Cordelia Hart's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her eyes darting between Alara and Rowan with dawning, uncomfortable understanding. But it was Lady Vivian's expression that struck Alara most forcefully, a rapid transformation from anger to horror, as the full weight of her own past cruelty came crashing down upon her in an instant. The public humiliation over the broken vase, the threats delivered so casually in the sewing room, the countless small indignities heaped upon a woman she had believed powerless, who had, in fact, held greater wealth and standing than the entire Ashcombe family combined. I did not know, Vivian said, her voice suddenly small and uncertain, so unlike her usual sharp confidence. I swear to you, I did not know. I am aware, Alara said quietly, though there was no warmth in her tone, only a tired, weary honesty. That was rather the point of my disguise, my lady. Rowan had remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of shock, confusion, and something else Alara could not quite name, though it made her chest tighten uncomfortably to witness. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of a man attempting to process an overwhelming revelation. You have been in my household for a week, he said slowly. Enduring treatment no companion should ever be forced to endure, while carrying a fortune that could have transformed this family's circumstances entirely, and you said nothing. I said nothing because I wished to be treated as a person, Your Grace, not as a fortune to be pursued, or a burden to be managed, Alara said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, the weeks of carefully suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. I have watched this household calculate the value of every conversation, every kindness, every marriage prospect, purely in terms of financial survival. I did not wish to become another such calculation. Lady Margaret, who had remained quiet throughout the entire dramatic revelation, finally spoke from her position near the window, her sharp eyes moving thoughtfully between her grandson, her granddaughter, and the young woman standing at the center of the room's sudden chaos. I have suspected the truth for some days now, she said calmly, drawing every eye toward her. I said nothing to either of you, because I wished to observe how this family would treat a woman we believed to have nothing, before the truth of her considerable fortune could color our behavior toward her. She paused, her gaze settling pointedly on Vivian. I confess, granddaughter, I am deeply disappointed in what I witnessed. Cruelty toward the powerless reveals a great deal about one's character, regardless of whether the powerless later prove to hold more power than any of us. Vivian's face had gone quite pale, and she said nothing in response. clearly too overwhelmed by shame to formulate any adequate defense of her past behavior. Mr. Hart, meanwhile, had recovered sufficiently from his initial shock to begin calculating the new landscape of opportunity now spread before him, his expression sharpening with familiar, transparent interest. "Miss Ashworth," he said, stepping forward with a broad, ingratiating smile. "What a remarkable turn of events. I do hope you will consider this household your friends, given the unfortunate misunderstanding of your circumstances. Perhaps, given this new information, there might be room for further discussion regarding the future arrangements of this family, arrangements that might benefit from your own considerable resources, as well as my daughter's." The transparent calculation in his words struck Alara as almost comically predictable, a mirror image of every fortune-hunting suitor who had besieged her in London following her father's death, and she felt a fresh wave of exhaustion at the realization that even this revelation would not spare her from the endless calculations of those who saw her only in terms of the wealth she carried. "I think," Rowan said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge of sharpness that silenced Mr. Hart's calculating enthusiasm immediately, "that this is not the appropriate moment for such discussions." He turned toward Alara, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of apology and something deeper, something that looked, to Alara's surprise, remarkably like genuine shame. "Miss Ashworth, I owe you an apology far greater than my sister's. I dismissed your observations, ignored your comfort, and allowed you to be treated poorly in my own household, all while remaining entirely blind to who you truly were, and more importantly, blind to the fact that such treatment was inexcusable, regardless of your true identity or fortune." Alara studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of the same calculating interest she had seen flash across Mr. Hart's face only moments before, but found instead only genuine, uncomfortable sincerity. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, though exhaustion colored her voice heavily. "If you will excuse me, I find myself in need of a moment alone, to process everything that has just transpired." She withdrew from the drawing room without waiting for further response, her legs carrying her swiftly through the familiar corridors toward her small room, though her mind remained behind in the drawing room, replaying every shocked and calculating expression she had witnessed, wondering how much of what followed would prove genuine, and how much would simply become another chapter in the same tired story of fortune and obligation she had already lived through once before in London. Behind her, the drawing room erupted into a flurry of hushed, urgent conversation, as the assembled family and guests began, each in their own way, to reckon with the sudden and dramatic transformation of the quiet companion they had known for barely a week into one of the wealthiest heiresses in the entire country. Alara had barely closed the door of her small room when a soft knock interrupted her solitude. She opened it to find Mrs. Bell standing in the corridor, her usually stern face carrying an expression of flustered uncertainty that Alara had never before witnessed on the housekeeper's features. "Miss Ashworth," Mrs. Bell began, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar name, "I have come to see whether you require anything at all. I would be glad to have your belongings moved immediately to one of the guest chambers in the family wing, far more suitable to your true position than this small room in the servants' quarters." Alara studied the older woman for a long moment, recognizing the sudden shift in treatment for exactly what it was, a transparent scramble to correct past disrespect, now that its true cost had become apparent. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell, but I find this room suits me well enough for the time being. I do not require any special treatment." "Of course, Miss Ashworth, whatever you prefer." Mrs. Bell hesitated, wringing her hands slightly. "I hope you understand. I had no knowledge whatsoever of your true circumstances. Had I known, I would never have assigned you such demanding tasks, nor allowed you to be served the coldest portions at meals. I acted only according to what I believed proper for a companion station." "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Bell," Alara said, her tone carrying a quiet weariness rather than any particular anger. "You treated me according to the position I presented to this household. I hold no particular grievance against you for that." The housekeeper's relief was palpable, though something in Alara's measured response seemed to leave her uncertain whether she had truly been forgiven or simply granted a polite dismissal. She withdrew from the doorway with several more stammered apologies, leaving Alara alone once more with her thoughts. The remainder of the morning brought a steady procession of similar visitors, each eager to smooth over past unkindness, now that the true weight of Alara's fortune had become common knowledge throughout the household. The young maid, who had once quietly confided her innocence regarding the broken vase, returned with genuine warmth, her earlier kindness unchanged by the revelation, and Alara found herself grateful for the few individuals in the house whose treatment of her had never depended on her perceived wealth or poverty. Lady Vivian, notably, did not appear at Alara's door that morning, though word reached her through the household grapevine that the young woman had retreated to her own chambers following the drawing room revelation, refusing to see anyone, her earlier sharp confidence apparently shattered by the weight of her own past cruelty, finally catching up with her. It was not until early afternoon that Vivian finally appeared, knocking hesitantly at Alara's door with none of her usual commanding presence. When Alara opened the door, she found the young woman's eyes red-rimmed, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled, as though she had spent the intervening hours in genuine distress rather than calculated repositioning. "May I speak with you?" Vivian asked, her voice small and uncertain in a manner Alara had not witnessed since her arrival. Alara considered refusing, weary of the endless procession of guilt and apology, but something in Vivian's genuine distress prompted her to step aside and allow the young woman entry into the small room. "I have spent the entire morning attempting to compose some adequate explanation for my behavior," Vivian began, sitting stiffly on the edge of the narrow bed, while Alara remained standing near the window, "and I have found none. There is no explanation that excuses cruelty towards someone I believed powerless, regardless of what that person's true circumstances later proved to be. I was cruel to you because I believed you could not defend yourself, and that alone reveals something ugly about my own character that I have been forced to confront today, perhaps for the first time in my life." Alara said nothing immediately, studying the young woman's genuine distress with a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and reluctant sympathy. "I have lived my entire life watching this family's fortunes decline," Vivian continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, though the words themselves carried a raw honesty Alara had not expected. "Watching my brother's shoulder burdens, no young man should have to carry alone, watching the estate crumble a little further each year, watching tenants suffer for debts they had no part in creating. I convinced myself that securing this marriage to Miss Hart justified any behavior necessary to protect it, including cruelty toward a woman I believed had no power to resist me. That was wrong, entirely wrong, and I am deeply sorry." "Fear does not excuse cruelty, my lady," Alara said finally, her voice carrying quiet firmness rather than anger. "But I understand fear well enough myself, having fled from my own circumstances in London, under precisely such pressure. I do not know that I can fully forgive what occurred this past week, but I do not hold it against you with the bitterness you perhaps expect." Vivian nodded, her eyes welling with fresh tears. "That is more grace than I deserve, given everything I said and did." "Perhaps," Alara said, "but grace given sparingly serves no one, least of all myself." Vivian rose, offering a final, unsteady curtsy, before withdrawing from the room, leaving Alara once again alone with her tangled thoughts. She had expected, upon the revelation of her true identity, to feel some measure of triumphant vindication, watching those who had scorned her scramble to make amends. Instead, she found only a weary sadness, a recognition that fear and desperation had driven behavior that kindness alone might have prevented, had circumstances been different for everyone involved. It was evening before Rowan finally sought her out, finding her in the small garden behind the manor, where she had retreated for a few precious moments of solitude, away from the chaos still churning through the household. He approached slowly, his expression carrying the same complicated weight she had noticed earlier that day, though something in his bearing now suggested a decision had been reached, a resolution finally crystallized after hours of private reflection. "I have spoken with my grandmother at length this afternoon," Rowan said, settling onto the stone bench beside her, though he kept a respectful distance between them. "And I have confronted my own conscience regarding the arrangement with Miss Hart's family." Alara said nothing, watching him carefully, uncertain what direction his words might take. "I have decided," Rowan continued, "that I cannot proceed with a marriage built entirely upon financial necessity, particularly not after witnessing, this past week, precisely what such calculated arrangements can lead a family to become. I watched my own sister transform into someone capable of genuine cruelty, all in service of securing a marriage neither she nor I truly wanted for its own sake, only for the desperate financial rescue it promised. "What will you do instead?" Ilara asked quietly. "I do not entirely know," Rowan admitted, a rueful smile touching his tired features. "The estate's debts remain, regardless of whatever decision I make regarding marriage. But I find I would rather face genuine ruin, with honest choices, than false salvation, built upon a marriage neither party truly desires." He paused, studying her carefully in the fading evening light. "I must also confess something else, Miss Ashworth. Something I have struggled with throughout this entire difficult day." "What is that, Your Grace?" "My growing regard for you did not begin this morning, with the revelation of your fortune," Rowan said, his voice carrying a raw honesty Ilara had not heard from him before. "It began days ago, in that hallway, when you observed with such perceptive honesty that I seemed burdened, when no one else in this entire household had bothered to look closely enough to notice. I have thought of that conversation often since, more often than I have been willing to admit even to myself, given my supposed obligations toward Miss Hart." Ilara's heart raced uncomfortably at his words, and she found herself, despite every careful instinct toward caution, unable to fully suppress the warmth spreading through her chest at his admission. "Your Grace, I must ask you honestly, does this admission arise from genuine feeling, or from the sudden knowledge of my fortune? I have fled from calculating suitors once already, and I could not bear to discover I had simply traded one such pursuit for another, however gently disguised." Rowan's expression carried genuine hurt at the suggestion, though he did not seem offended by her caution, only saddened by the necessity of it. "I understand why you must ask such a question, given everything you have endured. I can only offer you my honest word, for whatever it is worth to you, that my regard for you began before I knew your true name, before I understood the scope of your fortune, when I believed you nothing more than my grandmother's quiet companion. If that regard means nothing to you now, given the complicated circumstances surrounding its revelation, I will understand and withdraw entirely from any further such conversation." Ilara studied him for a long, silent moment, searching his expression in the fading light for any hint of the calculating interest she had witnessed so clearly in Mr. Hart's face that same morning, and found instead only earnest, uncertain sincerity, the expression of a man risking genuine vulnerability, rather than pursuing calculated advantage. "I do not know what to make of any of this, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice carrying honest confusion rather than outright rejection. "This past week has left me exhausted in ways I did not anticipate, and I find myself uncertain how to separate genuine feeling from the tangled circumstances surrounding it." "That is fair," Rowan said quietly. "I do not ask for any immediate answer, Miss Ashworth. I ask only that you consider the possibility that not everything in this house has changed entirely for the worse, even amid all this difficult upheaval." He rose from the bench, offering a small, respectful bow, before withdrawing back toward the manor, leaving Ilara alone once more in the quiet garden, her thoughts churning with confusion, cautious hope, and the lingering exhaustion of a week that had tested every reserve of patience and dignity she possessed. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, whether the genuine sincerity she had glimpsed in Rowan's expression would prove lasting, or whether the weight of financial desperation would once again reassert itself over whatever fragile connection had grown between them these past difficult days. But for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Manor, she found herself, cautiously and against her own better judgment, beginning to hope that something genuine might yet emerge from the wreckage of scorn and revelation this remarkable week had brought. The Hart family departed the following morning under a cloud of awkward, hurried farewells, Mr. Hart's earlier enthusiasm for the marriage arrangement having curdled into thinly veiled disappointment once Rowan quietly but firmly informed him, over a brief and uncomfortable private conversation, that he could not in good conscience proceed with an engagement built upon calculation rather than genuine affection. Cordelia herself seemed almost relieved by the news, her earlier bright smiles never having concealed particularly well the same reluctant resignation Rowan himself had carried throughout the entire visit. Ilara watched the departing carriages from an upstairs window, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and renewed uncertainty about her own position within the household, now that the engagement she had inadvertently disrupted had been formally abandoned. She had spent a restless night considering Rowan's confession in the garden, turning his words over in her exhausted mind, alongside memories of her father's own repeated warnings about the dangers of trusting affection too quickly, amid circumstances of sudden fortune. She resolved, as morning light filtered through her small window, that she could not remain at Ashcombe Manor indefinitely, under such uncertain terms. Her contracted season as Lady Margaret's companion had been built upon a foundation of deception, however well-intentioned, and now that the truth had emerged so dramatically, she felt an urgent need to establish clear boundaries for herself, separate from whatever complicated feelings had begun growing between herself and the Duke. She sought out Lady Margaret that morning, finding the old woman in unusually good spirits despite the previous day's dramatic upheaval, her sharp eyes carrying a satisfied gleam that suggested the outcome of her careful test had pleased her considerably. "I intend to depart within the week, my lady," Alara said, once their usual morning reading had concluded. "My father's estate requires my attention in London, and I believe it best that I return to settle those affairs properly, now that my true identity has become known." Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "I understand your reasoning, child, though I confess I had hoped you might consider remaining a while longer, given the circumstances that have developed this past week." "You mean my grandson's feelings toward you," Lady Margaret continued, when Alara said nothing in response. "Do not think me unaware of what transpired in the garden last evening. This house has few secrets that escape my notice, as I believe you have already discovered." "I do not know what to make of those feelings, my lady," Alara admitted honestly. "I have been deceived once already by declarations of affection that proved in truth to be calculations of fortune. I could not bear to discover the same pattern repeating itself here, however gently disguised." "A reasonable caution, given your experience," Lady Margaret said, nodding slowly. "But consider this, child. My grandson confessed his growing regard for you before he knew a single detail of your true fortune, believing you nothing more than a humble companion, with no resources beyond her modest wages. Whatever calculation might exist in his feelings now, it did not exist at their origin. That distinction matters a great deal, I think, if you are willing to consider it honestly." Alara said nothing, though the old woman's words settled uncomfortably close to thoughts she had already turned over extensively during her sleepless night. "I set this entire test in motion," Lady Margaret continued, "because I wished to see how my family would treat someone they believed powerless, before wealth could color their judgment. My granddaughter failed that test rather badly, though I believe her remorse today is genuine, and perhaps something useful may yet grow from the humility she has been forced to confront. My grandson, however, showed you unexpected kindness even before he understood your circumstances, defending you at that unfortunate dinner, seeking you out afterward with genuine concern rather than calculated interest. That is not nothing, Alara. That is, I think, rather everything." Alara left Lady Margaret's chamber that morning with her thoughts no less tangled than before, though something in the old woman's careful reasoning had planted a seed of consideration she could not easily dismiss. She spent the following days in quiet preparation for her departure, gradually revealing more of her true circumstances to the household staff, who had grown genuinely fond of her during her time as their companion, and found herself surprised by how many of them, upon learning the truth, expressed nothing but genuine happiness for her restored fortune, rather than the calculating interest she had half expected. Rowan, for his part, did not press her further during those final days, maintaining a respectful distance that Alara found, somewhat to her own surprise, she missed rather than appreciated. She caught glimpses of him occasionally throughout the house, walking the frost-covered gardens alone, his expression carrying the same weary burden she had noticed since her very first days at the manor, though now she understood its true weight far more completely than she had before. On the morning of her departure, her trunk once again loaded onto a waiting carriage, Alara made her way down the front steps of Ashcombe Manor, prepared to leave the strange, difficult week behind her entirely, uncertain whether she would ever return to this house or the complicated feelings it had stirred within her. She found Rowan waiting at the base of the steps, having clearly anticipated her departure, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he had shown throughout his engagement to Cordelia Hart, replaced instead by open, unguarded emotion that struck Alara forcefully in the quiet morning air. "You are leaving," he said, though it was not truly a question. "My father's estate requires my attention, Your Grace. I have delayed these obligations long enough already." "I understand." Rowan's expression carried genuine disappointment, though he made no move to prevent her departure, only studied her with quiet, careful attention. "I will not pretend I am not sorry to see you go, Miss Ashworth. Nor will I pretend my feelings toward you have changed in any way since our conversation in the garden. I meant every word I spoke that evening, and I mean it still, regardless of whatever fortune now separates our circumstances." Alara studied him carefully, searching his expression one final time for any hint of calculation, any shadow of the same predatory interest she had witnessed in countless suitors throughout her difficult months in London. She found none, only the same weary, genuine sincerity that had first drawn her attention during their brief collision in the hallway. A lifetime ago, it seemed, though barely a week had passed. "I have spent this entire week," she said slowly, "watching this household calculate the worth of every relationship in terms of fortune and survival. I fled from precisely such calculations in London, believing I might find some measure of peace disguised as a woman of modest means. Instead, I found cruelty, but I also found, unexpectedly, a man who showed me kindness before he ever understood the fortune I carried." "Alara," Rowan said quietly, using her true name for the first time, the word carrying a tenderness that made her chest ache with unexpected warmth. "I do not ask you to remain out of any obligation, nor do I offer my feelings in hopes of securing your fortune for this estate's salvation. I offer them simply because they exist, honestly and completely, regardless of what circumstances might follow." Alara felt the last of her careful defenses finally, gently, give way, replaced by a quiet certainty that had been building steadily since her sleepless night of consideration. "Perhaps," she said, a small smile finally touching her tired features. "My business in London might wait a little longer, Your Grace, if you would permit me to remain a while longer at Ashcombe Manor. Not as a companion this time, but simply as myself." Rowan's answering smile carried genuine, unguarded joy, the first such expression Alara had witnessed from him throughout their entire acquaintance, and he stepped forward, taking her hand gently in his own. "I would like nothing more, Alara, if you are certain this is truly what you wish." "I am certain," Alara said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. Behind them, watching from an upstairs window with evident satisfaction, Lady Margaret observed the scene unfolding in the courtyard below, her sharp eyes carrying the particular pleasure of someone who had orchestrated precisely the outcome she had hoped for, from her careful, quiet test. She thought of the week just past, of cruelty exposed and kindness rewarded, of fortune hidden and finally revealed, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, genuinely optimistic about her family's future. The carriage that had waited to carry Alara away was sent back to the stables, her trunk carried instead up to one of the finer guest chambers in the family wing, and Ashcombe Manor, so recently consumed by financial desperation and calculated marriage schemes, found itself instead settling into the quiet, hopeful rhythm of a courtship built upon genuine affection rather than desperate necessity. Lady Vivian, watching from a nearby window with her own complicated mixture of emotions, found herself resolving quietly to do better, to build whatever future lay ahead for this family upon kindness rather than fear, having learned, through considerable personal humiliation, precisely the cost of choosing cruelty toward those she had wrongly believed powerless. And Alara Ashworth, once merely Alara Whitmore, companion to an elderly dowager, found herself standing at the threshold of an entirely unexpected future, one built not upon the fortune she had spent so many difficult weeks trying to escape, but upon the quiet, genuine connection she had discovered, hiding beneath the surface of scorn and desperation that had first greeted her arrival at Ashcombe Manor. The house that had once treated her as nothing more than hired help now opened its doors to her, as someone infinitely more valuable than mere fortune could ever measure, a woman finally seen and valued for exactly who she was, scorn and secrets and hidden wealth alike, all woven together into the remarkable story of a week that had changed everything.